Let's start out by talking about Julie Beck's title. This article won't change your mind. What's great about this title is it's attention getting. Automatically, we're thinking, wait, usually writers want to influence us in some way with their writing. Here, this writer is coming out and telling us we're not going to change our mind after reading this article. So automatically we're intrigued and we want to read it because of that. But even more important, the title is relevant. When we read her essay, we realize that she's talking about innate biases that all of us have that can prevent us from acknowledging and receiving and believing facts when we see them. So not only is the title relevant to her point, which is the most important thing, but it's also engaging. Let's talk about her introduction. She starts with the story about this man Shaw, who had been going to some kind of meditation center and continued to go even after he found out the leader was lying. And so this anecdote is relevant because it connects to the whole point of the article about how we have internal biases and beliefs that kind of we often ignore the facts to hang on to those beliefs. But also anecdotes in general uh, are engaging. They get readers involved and engaged in your paper from the get-go. So the important thing to know is that the anecdote is engaging, so it fulfills that purpose of an introduction, but also it's relevant. That's the most important thing. Let's talk about transitioning not only within paragraphs but between paragraphs. So I've used this example from page 2, some paragraphs from that example. If we look at what is in blue, we'll see that the author uses transitional words to transition within the paragraphs, and even at times, such as the start of the third paragraph, she uses a transitional word though in that sentence to transition. So transitional words are good, and they do the purpose of moving us from one idea to another and showing us the relationship between those ideas. So if we look in the first paragraph, the last transition there says similarly. That shows us there is a connection, there's some kind of comparison being made between the idea that's going to be presented and the idea that was just presented. And in this case, she's talking about the study and how the church goers reacted the same as the smokers. Between paragraphs, though, there's a little more sophistication being used here. So in the second paragraph, the first sentence says, outside of a lab, this kind of selective exposure is even easier. That's a really great transition because in the previous paragraph, they were talking about a study being done. So in this paragraph, the start of it is outside a lab. So that shows us that now she's going to talk about it in real life, and yet the lab part of that reminds us of what we just read about a study that was done. Also notice selective exposure, this kind of selective exposure. I'll put that in green. That two-word phrase summarizes the whole conclusion of the study that was previously discussed in the previous paragraph. So this is where you can use synonyms to kind of remind readers of what they just read. The same thing goes for in the first sentence of the third paragraph where it says cushiony cave. That is referring to how we focus and stay within our own little bubble. And in purple, the first sentence of the second paragraph, you notice I put in purple this kind of selective exposure. That's just a very subtle way of using pronouns to connect your idea to whatever you previously said. So this refers to whatever was just discussed in the previous paragraph. So those are just a few ways you can transition between paragraphs and within paragraphs. Let's talk about how to integrate quotations into your writing, how to incorporate them. The One of the most sophisticated ways to incorporate quotations into your writing, and also a very clever way to try to limit your use of quotations because you don't want to overuse quotations, is to blend the quotation grammatically into your own sentence. I'm taking this example from page 1. Look at this sentence. Back in 1980, Shaw had arrived in Siddha Yoga Meditation Center in upstate New York during what he says was a, quote, very vulnerable point in my life. Notice that the quote is blended seamlessly into the sentence. So that's the only thing you have to watch out for with this method, is make sure when you're putting a quotation within your sentence that you're blending it grammatically. And one way to just test for this very simply is to just pretend that the quotation marks are not there and read the sentence. Does it make sense? If so, then you've blended it grammatically. However, on the other hand, you want to avoid dropping quotations. And what do I mean by dropping quotations? A quotation should not be in its own sentence. Now, journalists do this sometimes, and as I mentioned in one of the handouts at the beginning of class, you can learn a lot from these professional pieces, but that doesn't mean that everything they do you should emulate. So in this case, you do not want to emulate this. I've put in red the quotation. You can see it's in its own sentence. The previous sentence that the author wrote, they ended it with a period, and now the quotation's in its own sentence. Do not do this. Avoid this in your writing. It's considered a dropped quotation. Let's talk about the conclusion. Notice how I've just cut and pasted the conclusion. Notice how the writer refers to Shaw again, the story of Shaw, and that's the same story she opened the essay with. So notice how she's bringing the whole article full circle, and it reminds you of the story that began the essay, and it connects the whole essay for you, and she frames it that way. So that's a really sophisticated way of concluding your essay. So let's review what this short presentation has discussed. Create an engaging, relevant title. One way to introduce your essay is with a relevant, engaging anecdote. Transition within your paragraphs and between your paragraphs with certain techniques like transitional words, synonymous phrases, and pronouns. Between paragraphs, try to use a little more sophistication by using synonymous phrases. One way to introduce a quote is by blending it into your own sentence grammatically. Avoid dropping quotations. And finally, bring your essay full circle by referring to something from your introduction in your conclusion, if you can. So if you started with an anecdote, an image, a metaphor, try to bring that up smoothly in your conclusion, and that brings your essay full circle.